All right. Prior knowledge. This you don't have to write down yet, although if you want to get a head start on listing the characteristics of civilization, they are towards the bottom of the slide. So we began this unit with prehistory, right? Pre-literate cultures, cultures before writing, in the Paleolithic and in the Neolithic. We saw that the Neolithic Revolution over time gave rise to permanent settlements, and then food surplus, and then really big food surplus that allowed for huge degrees of specialization, relatively speaking, and eventually the growth of social hierarchy. Yesterday, we learned that as the population and food surplus grew, we had the rise of cities. And cities, as they progressed, as they grew, developed more and more complex forms of labor specialization and government. Labor specialization allowed people to work full-time as artisans, as religious leaders, as weapons makers, that sort of thing. And it caused social hierarchy to develop. Meanwhile, increasingly complex governments led building infrastructure, so like roads and canals and irrigation ditches and stuff. They began to keep records, written records, so we're in history now. And they created armies to defend their city, because if you have stuff, you have to defend it, or people tend to take it, because that's human nature. Sometimes competition over extra resources, surplus resources, led to conflict between different societies. So this is all stuff that we have learned over the last couple weeks. As this process continued over time, the people in these cities began to see themselves as being civilized, and they described the traits of their own societies as characteristics of civilization, the big vocabulary word for today. Like I said a couple of minutes ago, civilization is a very controversial word because of the way that it has been used throughout history. We'll get into that in a minute. As a result, there's no single agreed upon definition for it, and instead it helps to have like a list of features or characteristics that you can associate with civilization in order to be able to figure out if a case matches or not. The thing about these characteristics, though, is they are all effects of the Neolithic Revolution. So, in a sense, you probably already know them. Civilizations have social hierarchies, which means by definition they have to have food surplus and specialization. To have food surplus, they need settled agriculture, so that's one too. With specialization comes trade. Right? If I'm a weapons maker, I can't eat swords, I have to trade in order to get food, right? So trade develops. With trade comes writing, because written records were originally all about keeping trade records. They had more complex systems of government and religion, which we learned yesterday is a simple effect of settling near farmland and eventually having population growth. And war or conflict between their society and others. So these are all effects of the Neolithic Revolution. They're all effects of having food surplus and being able to specialize and staying in one place. But the different ways that each culture managed to kind of march through this series of effects created, different cultures. We know what cultures are. And the thing about culture is they can bring people together if the people feel like they're a part of it. And by definition, in like bringing people together around a culture, they define groups that do not belong. So again, a brief list for civilization. And at this point, we are in our key points. So I would like you to write these down in your notebooks. You're going to use them a lot, actually, throughout the next week. So actually making a list somewhere where you can find it will save you a lot of time moving forward. So again, civilizations. Controversial word. But if you're going to try to be objective about it, you should look for places with cities, farming and food surplus, specialization, social hierarchy. Often they produce art, complex governments, organized religion, record keeping, so like systems of writing, and our word from yesterday, infrastructure, meaning building the things that society needs to function collectively, like roads, irrigation ditches. Back in the day, it was mostly those things. The reason civilization is controversial is because it implies superiority over other societies, and it is subjective. It depends on who's looking. The superiority thing is why it is so controversial. And I'll give you an example that I'm sure you can think of, like a pop culture reference to match, but like, I feel like this must have been from Pocahontas, the Disney movie or something. But when European settlers came to the Americas, not settlers, conquistadors, conquerors, right? When Europeans came to the Americas and colonized the natives here, Europeans felt very superior. They felt like they were bringing civilization to the natives, and they felt this because of their technology, and they felt they had a superior religion. So like they had guns, the natives didn't. Clearly Europeans have the upper hand. Civilization, though, it's also a concept kind of based on the rules of society, right? Like, do you follow our rules or do you not? And so the natives that were being colonized could also see themselves as a civilization superior to the Europeans in terms of their values. The natives, especially the ones that initially came into contact with the Europeans, had cultures about sharing, right? Private property wasn't quite so a serious thing over here as it had been in Europe. And so this idea that like these people would come and kill people in order to get gold, that seems uncivilized, right? Murder is kind of not a very civilized thing. So it really depends on the perspective and by which criteria you're using the word civilization. And we're going to see this throughout the whole year. So the list is on the left side of the slide again, in case you're still copying that down. But to clarify, the stuff on the right you don't have to write down, but listen, because it kind of helps. Civilization, then, it's a conceptual definition. It's a concept. It's not a thing. It's not like a cup of coffee that I can point to and touch and like, this is a cup of coffee. It's a social construct. It's a word we've invented for a thing in order to be able to talk about different kinds of categories that don't physically exist naturally in nature, right? It is a word that is constructed with bias. When it is used, there is usually some bias in it. And I think that picture at the bottom right does a pretty good job of illustrating that bias. People tend to think about themselves in good terms. That works on a person-to-person level, and it works as a big society-to-society level. It's a natural inclination. Got a good question in the chat. Is everything biased even though the author claims not to be? And in a way, there are objective truths and facts, and those are important, and we get those from science. So like, if I say that gravity exists, that's not a biased statement. You can test it. It's objective. It can be measured. But anything that depends on your perspective, on the way you look at things, it's probably kind of biased. It's not necessarily a bad thing. It's a human nature kind of thing. But it is something that we have to be aware of when we're reading written sources. And here's like a great place where history just ties into like life skills, because most written sources, if you read an article in the news, if you read, right, period, you're reading something that somebody else wrote, you're reading an explanation that somebody else gave of whatever it is they're writing about. their explanation is funneled through their point of view. And so like the best way really to get to the truth in history and in life is to read widely, to read lots of different sources, to ask lots of questions, to think critically. So yeah, biases depend on the person. Part of it's point of view, some of it is psychology. Human nature, like we're not perfectly rational in our brains. We have like, man, I'm gonna go on a tangent. I don't want to do this for the whole class, but like human nature, the way our brains are wired, don't function perfectly rationally. There are all these things called fallacies and cognitive biases that describe like little flaws in the way people tend to think that we know about. And so like knowing about, we can correct them, but they do exist. One of those is we tend to see ourselves in pretty flattering terms, and we tend to not be quite so graceful when we're trying to understand other people. It requires an extra little effort of empathy, usually. You know, we judge ourselves by our intentions, we judge other people by their actions. That's not a good thing, but it is a human nature thing. And it shows up in the historical record because the historical record is created by human beings. So this is a great question. Thank you for asking it. Everything is biased. That doesn't mean that everything is untrue. It just means that it's always worth keeping in mind or thinking about the point of view of the person that you're like analyzing or whose source you're reading. Now as in the past. Okay, we are going to start looking at the flip side of civilization. And that is barbarism, which is also not a nice word, and we're going to talk about it too. So in order to do this, we need to think back a little bit too. Remember that when people settled down to farm in the Neolithic Revolution for sedentary agriculture, only some people settled down to farm. There were still others who kept a nomadic lifestyle. Some people remained hunter-gatherers. There are hunter-gatherers still around today. Some people practiced pastoralism, which meant being a nomad, moving around from place to place, but not in search of food, with livestock that's grazing. So still nomads, still outside of settled civilization, but practicing a form of agriculture. When we think about what we know about the past and the records that we are left with, it's really important to always think about whose voices we're not hearing. And a big voice that is just kind of a void is this group of like nomads, because nomads tend not to leave really detailed historical records. So what we know about the past is already biased because we're already mostly seeing it through the points of view of settled civilizations, because they're the people who leave records most of the time. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Right. For barbarians, right? So like the key civilization means a lot of things, right? Like we were saying, there's that objective list of effects of the Neolithic Revolution that we can like kind of take off and be like, okay, this place has cities, it has specialization, it has hierarchy, government, religion, trade, writing. Okay, there's civilization. But the way that people use the word is always a little different. And it usually has something to do with like culture, which means like the rules and norms and the ways that people behave and the laws by which they live their life. When people call themselves civilized, they mean that they're like living by a certain set of rules that govern their behavior. People who are uncivilized, generally, what they're really saying is those people don't follow our rules. They don't do things our way. Civilizations tend to, in the past and now, view people who don't follow the same rules, norms, laws, general culture as being uncivilized. And the word that they used for this was barbarians. These are key points, please write them down. A barbarian, like Conan the Barbarian, not a nice thing to call people. A barbarian is a person who is perceived to be uncivilized, who is seen to be uncivilized, who has traits that do not fit into civilized society, however that is being defined. So it can be like excessive cruelty or inability to adapt to social norms or anything like that. If we were in a real classroom and somebody came in screaming and like took off all their clothes and ran around, we'd be like, that person is uncivilized. We all have rules that we're following, whether we realize that or not, and that person does not fit in. They, you know, we need to educate them. But it's all about perception, and that is really the key. It also assumes that whatever the culture, norms, laws, and rules that are governing a civilization are good and better than not having them, and that's usually a pretty big assumption. So, pastoral societies, like we learned a couple days ago, were nomadic. They didn't have big population densities. They didn't have permanent settlements. They were outside of the control of any state. And so they had few or no traits of civilization. That list of objective things like food surplus, specialization, et cetera, they didn't have every single thing. So by that criteria, they're outside the category of civilization. As happens with human beings, this is another like thing we are hardwired to do, and it's not necessarily great, but people tend very naturally, in a very self-serving kind of way, to contrast themselves with other people all the time, of kind of trying to find their own identity, usually in terms that are more flattering to you than to the other people that you're contrasting yourself against. And the people in cities, in these settled civilizations, began to contrast their civilization with what they started to see as inferior barbarism of everybody on the outside, nomads, pastoral people, other civilizations, barbarians. And again, these are words that are loaded. They are not neutral. It is not a nice thing to call another group of people barbarians. And historically, doing that has led to some pretty horrible episodes in human history. In terms of the way that like these nomads interacted with people in settled civilizations, it was complicated because they needed each other, but they also had very good reasons to come into conflict pretty often. Sometimes civilizations got along with the nomads outside their border, and often this was because nomads are really important to trade. Because they move around from place to place, like we covered a couple days ago, nomads provided really great links between civilizations because they could navigate the land that was like really hard to live with and really hard to get through between them. So they were like super important for cultural diffusion in addition to trade and getting new technologies and new ideas. And because nomads themselves don't have the ability to have high degrees of specialization, they would often trade with people in settled civilizations to get things that they need that they couldn't make, like metal working stuff or like weapons, tools. So like in the best case, they helped each other. Sometimes though, they clash. There are two reasons for pastoral and mostly pastoral nomads and settled civilizations to clash. First, sometimes the nomads did attack settled civilizations to like raid and get what they needed that way. Also though, states, when they want resources, they like to expand, right? And that means like moving territory bigger. Civilizations often then expanded into territory that used to be held by nomads, and that's a very good reason for them to have conflict too. Here's why all of this matters, and this should be the last slide. Yay. Throughout history, calling a group barbaric or uncivilized has often been used as an excuse to conquer or exploit or harm them. It can be a very dehumanizing thing to say that there's a group of people who are barbarians, because really what you're saying is like they are not up to your level. They're not quite at your stage. And throughout history, calling people a group uncivilized barbarians is usually an excuse that people use to conquer them. This is a hard thing to explain because it sounds like super silly when you say it out loud, but it really does happen over and over and over. The idea being, I'm civilized. Me and my people are civilized. Caesar's people are barbarians. So, because I am so kind and charitable with my civilization, I'm going to conquer Caesar's people. So, like, you know, kill half of them, take their stuff, enslave the rest. But I'm going to do all of that in order to bring them the benefits of my superior advanced civilization, because those poor barbarians would have never figured it out on their own, is kind of how that works. And if you pay attention in history, you will see that again and again and again. It just changes in terms of like how you're using the word civilized. Like, we're going to bring democracy to the Middle East, so let's conquer Iraq for its oil. Or the Roman Empire, we're going to bring civilization to Judea and take all their stuff. Or Europeans for the Americas, right? We're going to bring civilization to the barbarian natives. And by that, they meant Christianity, but really what they wanted was gold, right? So that's one reason to be very careful with this term, because a lot of communities historically have been very hurt by it. Often, a society's leaders would say they are conquering another community in order to make them more civilized, but in reality, they just want to seize that land and take the resources. If you keep those two ideas in your head, history makes so much more sense. They're like a nice set of reasons that we're going to give to do this really violent, terrible thing that we're really doing because we want stuff. A second reason that we need to keep this distinction in mind is because it affects the way we read and write history. Like we said at the beginning of class, primary sources, historical sources, written sources, tend to come from settled civilizations because they can specialize enough. They have enough of a food surplus to have the kind of specialization to create writing systems and preserve them. So most of what we know about, especially the very distant past, comes from the civilized point of view. So what we know about people that were pastoral nomads or people who are in other less successful maybe civilizations comes from the eyes of people who perceive them to be inferior. And so that's something that we always have to keep in mind. If somebody in a settled civilization writes about a group of barbarians as like, you know, human, primitive, however horrible they're going to do it, we can't just accept that as like fact. That is a very biased point of view. And unfortunately, the historical record doesn't always give us a chance to like weigh it against a barbarian, quote unquote, perspective, if that makes sense. Caesar asks if ancient Egypt was like this. Yeah, groups of humans, when you get groups of humans together, this is a thing that we do. I'm sure that you have noticed, like, people tend to excuse their own behavior and blame other people for theirs on very different standards. In groups, people tend to create in-groups and out-groups all the time. Yeah, it's just like, it's a sad fact of human life. And then, yes, eventually they got conquered by the Romans, so haha. And then eventually the Romans got conquered by barbarians, which is kind of why that fun story is fun. So I like the barbarian side of history, so we'll get there. Anyway, here is what we're doing today with all of this.